If someone said that a government tried to chemically make people smarter, it would probably sound like an exaggeration, or like some Cold War science fiction. But in the Soviet Union, this was not a joke. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union seriously studied the idea that human cognitive performance could be chemically adjusted. Not because they wanted to turn people into geniuses, but because they wanted people to function more reliably when the stakes were at their highest. When one mistake didn't mean a bad grade, but a chain reaction. When pressure didn't just make people tired, but revealed who could perform and who began to make mistakes. And the interesting part is this: some of these substances never disappeared. They are still being used. This video is not about instructions, not about what anyone should do, but about why the Soviet Union saw humans as machines and what they learned when they tried to tune them. To understand the motives, you have to understand the situation the Soviet Union was in. The Cold War was not just an arms race. It was a constant competition over which system worked better, on paper and in practice. In the West, competition showed itself in people wanting to create innovations and build businesses. In the Soviet Union, it appeared as demands placed on citizens. In the West, a person could fail, change direction, and choose a different career path. In the Soviet Union, this freedom of movement was much smaller. Education, skills, and sometimes even personality guided people into specific roles, and it was not easy to deviate from them. Once someone was assigned to a particular task, the expectation was that they would stay there. Not because it was their dream job, but because every position in the system had to be filled. Human performance was not a personal matter. It was part of the system's capacity. And that is exactly why the Soviet Union could not afford a romantic view of humans. Motivation was not enough. Ideology was not enough. Willpower was not enough. When the load becomes high enough, all systems begin to behave in the same way. They break. For Soviet researchers, this was not a philosophical question. It was a technical problem. If a human is part of a system, and the system fails because of the human, then the human must be understood in the same way as any other critical component. Not because the human is defective, but because the human has limits. And during the Cold War, the Soviet Union wanted to know where those limits truly were, and whether they could be moved. Chemically. When the Soviet Union began looking for ways to improve cognitive performance, stimulants were the first logical solution. Substances like amphetamine, known in the Soviet Union as phenamine, quickly raised the level of alertness in the central nervous system. They affected dopamine and norepinephrine, neurotransmitters that regulate attention, reaction speed, and task focus. In practice, this led to very concrete benefits. People stayed awake longer, reaction times became faster, distractions were reduced. Work continued without breaks, and tasks were completed more efficiently. By these measures, stimulants worked. For this reason, the Soviet Union also developed its own slightly different alternatives. For example, mesocarb, known as sidnocarb, was an attempt to produce a stimulating effect without the sharp peak of amphetamines. It worked more slowly, caused less euphoria, and kept alertness more stable. But the basic logic was still the same. The nervous system was activated directly. Later, substances such as phenylpiracetam were also introduced and were used, among other things, in the space program. It combined nootropic and stimulating properties, better alertness, better stress tolerance, and longer functional capacity under demanding conditions. and in certain situations, these substances did work well. But at the same time, the measurements began to reveal a problem. Stimulants did not make performance more stable. They made it more unpredictable. The peak went higher, but the crash was steeper. Performance improved only for a few hours, and the substances had to be taken continuously to maintain the achieved level of performance. From the Soviet perspective, this was a decisive finding. They were not looking for short-term enhancement. They were looking for a substance that could guarantee longer-term effects. When the effects of stimulants became well understood, the Soviet Union moved on to the next question. Performance was no longer pushed higher. Instead, the goal was to prevent it from breaking under pressure. At this point, peptides entered the picture. Substances like C-Max and Salank were developed specifically for situations where stress, lack of sleep, and heavy load began to show up as mistakes. Peptides did not increase energy as such. They reduced interference. Under stress, the brain becomes overactivated. Stimuli feel stronger, and decision-making becomes rushed. Peptides dampened this overreaction. They helped the brain stay closer to normal, even when the conditions were not normal. In practice, this showed up in simple ways. Focus held together for longer. Fewer mistakes were made. Most people did not feel the peptides in any obvious way. No euphoria, no spike, just this. The brain recovered faster and stayed functional for longer. That is exactly why these substances never fully disappeared from the market. They are still used, unofficially. When it became clear that peptides could slow down the breakdown of performance under pressure, the researchers' next question was obvious. Could recovery of the brain be sped up using the same logic? Not by increasing output, but by returning the nervous system to its normal state faster. After cognitively demanding periods, the problem was no longer acute stress. The problem was the after state, often described in everyday language as brain fog. Focus remained weak and thinking felt unclear. At this stage, the peptides already mentioned were used again. C-Max was one of the key ones. It was found to support brain recovery from heavy load, especially in terms of focus and decision-making. In practice, this meant that thinking became clear again more quickly after intense periods. Another important peptide was Salank. Its role was linked specifically to calming the stress system. When the nervous system did not remain overactivated, recovery also became faster. Less restlessness, less residual load. In some contexts, other peptides such as cortexin were also used. Research on it focused on supporting neuron function after stress and damage. This did not mean immediate enhancement, but rather that functional capacity returned more steadily. From the researchers' perspective, this was decisive. When recovery became faster, load no longer accumulated cycle after cycle. A person was not at peak performance, but they returned to their own normal level and stayed there more often. And this is exactly what made peptides a long-lasting solution. Most of these substances did not disappear with the Soviet Union. They simply disappeared from public discussion. Some of them are still available today, although many peptides, for example, never received official approval for sale outside the Soviet Union, with the exception of Russia. Today, however, the pressure does not come from the state. No one is ordering people to develop more efficient brains. The pressure comes from the individual. Studying, working life, constant cognitive load. As stress increases and demands grow, more and more people begin looking for ways to cope. At this point, the same question emerges again. Can brain function be improved chemically? For this reason, the peptides developed in the Soviet Union have also resurfaced. Not in official medicine, but in informal discussion. Even well-known internet figures, such as Andrew Huberman and Joe Rogan, are often mentioned in the same context. In the end, the question is not whether these substances should be used, but what kind of competition people feel they are living in, and why so many feel that they are willing to make themselves test subjects for the long-term effects of these substances.